Just going to hold on for a moment or two to allow people to get in and to get themselves comfortable before we get started. So we just bear with us for a moment. Good evening and welcome, anyone joining us. We're just going to wait a moment or so to allow everyone to get in, and we'll get going now in just a moment. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mary. I'm a Community Resource Officer with Epilepsy Ireland, and I'd like to welcome you all here this evening. You can see the numbers coming through. So it's great to have so much interest in this topic, and it's a really important topic. We are delighted to have two expert speakers with us this evening. So we're going to have two talks, two presentations. But before we get going, just want to go through a little bit of housekeeping with you. First of all, we've had a couple of questions in advance, and we will have a Q&A session towards the end of the meeting, so we'll be able to put questions to our speakers. If you would like to submit a question, you'll see at the bottom of the screen there's a Q&A function. So maybe later on through the meeting you might want to put in a question. We won't be answering questions live as they come in, but we will try to answer as many questions as you put to us as possible during the Q&A session. And just to point out as well, unfortunately, we can't answer questions of a very specific or individual nature, but there will be the option for follow-up with one of our community resource officers afterwards if there is something more specific that you need some direction on as well. So just getting back to this evening's talk, I suppose our topic this evening is promoting positive mental health, so focusing on well-being and our mental health. So we'll be discussing what actually is well-being, how we may become more aware of our own mental health and well-being, and how we might enhance that. So we'll have some practical advice as well, and also sources of support that you can access in your own community on that area. And I suppose we're particularly mindful and focusing on epilepsy, on how epilepsy may impact our mental health, but equally how our mental health may be impacted by epilepsy. So whether you're a person living with epilepsy or a family member of someone with epilepsy, a carer, a friend, health professional, you're very welcome here this evening. So as I said earlier, we're going to have two speakers. First this evening, we're delighted to have Dr. Sarah Clarke. So Sarah is Senior Clinical Neuropsychologist in Beaumont Hospital. She's going to talk with us first. Secondly, then we're delighted to have Miffy Hoad. Miffy is the development worker with Mental Health Ireland. So I'm sure you've heard of them and their work, and she's going to be giving us some very important information and advice on how we can work on our own self-care as well. Yeah, so just to say before we go, we will have a very short survey at the end of the meeting. We'd be very grateful if you have the time to complete that. And there's also an option there for follow-up if you so wish afterwards. So I'm just going to move out of my screen share, and I'm going to hand you over to our first speaker this evening. So just to bear with me for one moment while we get the presentations ready. So first up this evening, we have Dr. Sarah Clarke. Sarah, if you'd like to join us there.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Hi, Mary. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly. Thank you, Sarah.
Great. Okay. So good evening, everybody. And first of all, I just need to apologize because I couldn't figure out how to share my screen. So Mary is in the driving seat and I'm not sure what's going on there, but there's a...
Apologies. We're back at the beginning now. Thank
a
you.
very brief run through. I'm finished. Thanks. So I'm sorry, I have to get Mary to move on my slides, and that is completely my fault for being a bit technologically not very able. But I just want to thank everyone who's logged on this evening. I'm sorry we can't meet in person, but hopefully it won't be too long before we're back to face-to-face interactions. And thanks especially to Tara and Agnes and Mary and everyone in Epilepsy Ireland for inviting me to speak this evening. So I'll just move on, Mary, thanks. So just what I'm going to cover this evening is just a little bit about what do we mean by mental health and well-being. You know, what actually are we talking about when we think of these concepts? I'm going to frame things a little bit more specifically then within the context of epilepsy, and what are the particular challenges to well-being that may be more likely to occur in epilepsy. And then finally, I'm going to finish with just a little bit of thinking about personal barriers to self-care and well-being, and just becoming a little bit more aware of what some of these might be. So thanks, Mary. So when we think of well-being and mental health, and in fact, when we were thinking about this talk this evening, we were kind of thinking, well, are we going to talk about well-being or mental health or both? And I think sometimes all the terminology can add to the confusion about these concepts. You know, we think of well-being, we think of coping, we think of self-care, and we think of stress, and you know, when does that move into mental illness, or you know, how does that overlap with mental health? And just next slide there, Mary, please. I think for today, I suppose I'm going to frame well-being as being really along a continuum, so from well-being to some distress, and then at the more severe end, moving into mental illness. And for me, well-being is a broad topic, and it includes multiple domains of functioning: our physical well-being, emotional, social, etc. And so it's a fairly broad area. And I think mental health is part of that. So just the next bit there, Mary, please. Just for today, what we're really going to focus on is what we can each do to promote well-being. And in doing so, I think this will helps to protect our mental health. So these things are related and connected. But I want to really emphasize as well that it's really important to acknowledge that, you know, when we are experiencing mental health difficulties, we're not saying for a minute that maintaining good well-being is enough to help with that. So people experiencing mental health difficulties may require external support and input, and we're very conscious of that. And I think it's also important to note that this is not in any way a failure of managing your well-being or a lack of coping skills. You know, mental health difficulties are very real, and they require support and help, and it's really important that we realize this. So however, though, sometimes I think what can be hard to figure out is, you know, where does it go from being I'm a little bit down or having a bad day to actually I'm now beginning to tip into a clinical depression? And similarly with things like anxiety, you know, how can I tell if I'm just a bit worried, or am I kind of starting to head towards an anxiety disorder as such? And it's a very individual thing, you know, we can't really talk about specifics as such, but I tend to be saying to people is if the difficulties you're experiencing are persistent, so if they're ongoing, if they're pervasive, so they occur across all parts of your life, and if they're impacting on how you can go about your daily functioning, then it might be a good idea to have a chat with your GP or neurologist or anybody who's involved in your healthcare. Or if that's maybe a step too far initially, to at least talk to a friend or somebody you trust. And of course, you know, also being mindful that if it's, you know, an acute problem. Of course, I'm not saying to wait and wait and talk to your GP, but if anyone's having thoughts, for example, of harming themselves, that's about immediately, getting yourself to safety, getting to A&E or calling the Samaritans. And so just to frame it in that context, while we're focusing really on well-being, we're also acknowledging, the importance of treating mental health difficulties appropriately. So I'm going to move on now and start talking a little bit more specifically about epilepsy and the challenges to well-being. And I'm going to touch on mental health difficulties. So unfortunately, psychiatric difficulties are common in people with epilepsy, and they can be underdiagnosed. And, such difficulties can include depression, anxiety, psychosis, non-epileptic seizures, and other neuropsychiatric conditions such as autism and attention deficit disorder. The relationship between epilepsy and mental health difficulties can be really complex, and there is evidence to suggest that sometimes neuropsychiatric difficulties can be a risk factor for the later development of epilepsy. So we talk about, in some cases, a bidirectional relationship. And what we mean by this is sometimes people will develop mental health difficulties and then go on to develop epilepsy. And for other people, it's the other way around, and they will present initially with epilepsy and then unfortunately go on to also develop a mental health difficulty. But what this tells us is that there are likely some common underlying mechanisms in the brain that contribute to all these conditions. And this is a huge focus of research that's ongoing because it has implications for treatment. So research shows us that anxiety and depression are the most common mental health difficulties in people with epilepsy, and I'm going to focus a little bit more on these in the next couple of slides. So in terms of major depression, the incidence of depression in epilepsy is higher than what we'd see in the general population, and recent meta-analyses show that up to almost a quarter of people with epilepsy may at some point experience symptoms of clinical depression. It may be under-recognized and undertreated, and of course I don't need to talk or explain or tell anybody about the difficulties accessing appropriate mental health services and the long waiting lists and the challenges that brings. But another factor can be that many people with epilepsy are on quite a lot of medication, and the idea of having to contemplate taking more medication can just be a step too far, which I think is very understandable. So the next slide then is we're going to talk a little bit about anxiety. Anxiety is a broad umbrella term in a way. There are several subtypes of anxiety disorder. So when we speak of anxiety, we're referring to conditions such as generalized anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, specific phobias, and then things like social anxiety. And again, research tells us that there's a high rate of anxiety in people with epilepsy. The most frequent type of epilepsy associated with anxiety is epilepsy arising from a specific part of the brain called the limbic system. And if you can see that picture of that person's brain, it's that little red area deep in the brain, in the temporal lobes. And this part of our brain is involved in managing our emotions and also is to do with our memory. And so it's involved very much in that fight or fight response, or that kind of mechanism we have to protect us from danger, which of course anxiety is that feeling of threat that we get, and it makes sense then when this area is activated that people experience anxiety symptoms. But it's not just seizures arising from the limbic system that result in anxiety for people. Anxiety is also associated with generalized epilepsy also. And so, of course, both anxiety and depression may occur as a reaction to epilepsy as well, and lots of aspects of epilepsy, which I'll talk about in a moment, are anxiety provoking, and these include things like fear of a seizure happening, loss of control, and feelings of helplessness. And unsurprisingly, there's also an increased rate of social anxiety among people with epilepsy. And I think, again, partly due to the unpredictability of the condition, not knowing maybe when a seizure will happen or where you might be when that happens and what the outcome will be. And the final point around anxiety is that we know that the presentation of focal seizures, particularly those coming from the temporal lobe and limbic system, and panic attacks can look almost identical. And there can be a risk then of misdiagnosis. And I certainly have had quite a few people coming into clinic who will tell you that for a while they thought they had thought that they had panic disorder, and it turned out they actually were having epileptic seizures. So really tricky sometimes to tease these things out. Next slide, please. Thanks, Mary. So just again to acknowledge, it's really important that we identify and treat mental health difficulties in epilepsy. The research tells us that actually depression and anxiety can have a greater effect on quality of life than epilepsy-related factors such as seizure frequency or duration of living with epilepsy. And just an earlier study, just again showing, high rates of psychiatric difficulties among people with epilepsy relative to people in the general population. And my next slide then, I'm just going to briefly touch on anti-epileptic medications and the impact of these on mental health. So unfortunately, like all medications, anti-epileptic medications have some significant side effects. So I'll just move on there, Mary, please. And the most common side effects are sedation, so feeling sleepy, weight gain, and cognitive impairment, none of which are, anything that people would welcome into their lives. So I'm just checking my time here. If you're wondering what I'm looking at here to the side, just checking I'm on time. In terms of mental health, AEDs or anti-epileptic drugs can have both positive and negative effects. And certainly the negative effects can be significant and include a wide range of difficulties. And again, really important for these to be monitored and correctly identified. But also to remember that we have strong evidence of positive effects of anti-epileptic medications, particularly on mood stabilizing and having an antidepressant effect. An example of this would be lamotrigine or Lamictal. In terms of vulnerability to side effects of anti-epileptic drugs on mental health functioning, the risk increases with younger age, with people with developmental delay, with a past history of mental health difficulties, and with polypharmacy. So when you're on more than one medication to treat your epilepsy, unfortunately, you're more likely to be at risk of side effects that may impact on mental health functioning. So next slide, please, Mary. Overall, I think it's a constant balancing act for you and your treating doctor, of course, trying to get the best seizure control while also trying to minimize the side effects. And I think that's an ongoing challenge for people living with epilepsy and for those caring for them. So the next thing I'm going to talk a bit about moving away from actually the more clinical mental health diagnoses to thinking a bit about what other challenges to well-being co-occur with epilepsy. And I'm thinking more here about adjustment, what we call adjustment. And I suppose when we think about illness, an acute illness is an illness that comes on suddenly, typically lasts for a particular amount of time. And then hopefully, there's a recovery period and you may get back to baseline well-being, or you may be left with some residual difficulties. But basically that model is of becoming unwell, putting your life on hold as you recover, for example, with a broken leg, and then gradually getting back to your functioning. But unfortunately, with a condition like epilepsy, that isn't the way it works. And what we're looking at is a chronic condition. And the challenge of that is not about putting life on hold until you get better, because that isn't really an option. The challenge instead is having to adapt and adjust and integrate this unwelcome visitor into your life, and how to best minimize the impact of that on your functioning. And this is an ongoing challenge to well-being. And just some of the common themes that come up just in the next slide there, Mary, that come up when we're thinking about the impact of epilepsy. Very often I hear people talking about loss. So loss and the grief that goes with that. So this can be loss of control, you know, unpredictability of epilepsy, loss of independence, the loss of ability to drive. It might be a loss of job, or, you know, reduction in options about work and vocation, or choices about maybe family. It can be a loss of your role, you know, or what you had hoped to achieve in your life, that might have altered. And there may be some guilt in relation to this, but also frustration, anger, and feelings of worthlessness, maybe low self-esteem. And, you know, if I meet somebody with epilepsy and unless I see them having a seizure, it's unlikely I'm going to know they have epilepsy unless they tell me. So this whole idea of an invisible burden and perception of others, and the stigma, unfortunately, that can still be associated with epilepsy, no more than with mental health difficulties. So it's just the next slide, please, Mary. So and that can lead to that issue of, you know, you look great, there's nothing wrong with you, and that can be really, really challenging for people. And often people say, you know, it'd be easier if I, you know, had a crutch or a bandage on my head. And just to acknowledge as well that adjustment isn't something that just you start and then you finish. It's an ongoing process, and it's a lifelong thing, really. So as we go through life, at different stages in life, we meet with different challenges. And I think the thing to acknowledge is that when you're also trying to accommodate a chronic illness into your life, those challenges are amplified. And you know, it's an extra challenge to well-being when you're trying to navigate around this. So you can just skip through that there. Thanks, Mary. And then just to summarize, I suppose, some of the challenges that are inherent in epilepsy in terms of challenging well-being. I didn't really touch on cognitive difficulties, which are, you know, can be a huge difficulty within epilepsy, and particularly memory difficulties, also attention and concentration. But all these things feed into each other, you know, and create this kind of vicious cycle. And again, just about us acknowledging some of the challenges to well-being that are there for people living with epilepsy, and also, as Mary said, for those who are caring for or working with people with epilepsy. So I'll move on now to I suppose moving more towards now thinking about well-being and self-care. So we've talked a bit about epilepsy and the challenges to well-being, and I think that highlights obviously the importance of self-care, and particularly when we're living with a chronic illness. And I would imagine that most of you listening in are thinking, but you're, you know, I know that, you know, we know this, we know that well-being is a good thing, and we know that self-care is a good thing. And often then, I suppose I think, well, then why do we even need to talk about it? We all know it's a good thing. You know, why do we need to talk about it? And it, you know, I suppose it gets me thinking about, you know, what are the barriers to self-care and well-being? And I'm just going to spend the last couple of minutes talking about that. So I'll just move on there. Thanks, Mary. And I'm not talking here about barriers such as access to services, because obviously that is a huge barrier. You know, I'm talking more about internal barriers or circumstantial ones that we might have within our lives. And it's just a way to start thinking about addressing some of these. So certainly, I suppose I'm going to talk about barriers that affect me. And I'm very conscious these may be personal and not really relevant to anybody else, but all I want is to get this conversation going about what might be your barriers to well-being. And a common one for me is, well, I don't have time, I just don't have enough time. Another one, which isn't really, I have to say, like, I would love to go to a lovely spa like the Monart, and, you know, I don't really have enough money for that. But I'm also conscious that there are other ways for me to engage in well-being. But all in all, having loads of money would probably help. I mean, I could go down to working part-time, that would be lovely. And, you know, I presume my boss isn't listening into this, but just in case, I love my job, but half-time would be nice. And another very common one is, I'm too tired. I don't have enough energy, so I'm not going to do anything to help myself because I'm just too tired. Or you could be like these guys on the steps here in the middle going, well, I don't really know where to start. I don't know how to do it. I don't really know what this means or how to do it. And Miffy is going to give us loads of really good ideas about, ways to help well-being. And I think the lovely thing about what she's going to talk to you about is I don't think money is an issue because, we have to be able to get over barriers to well-being and try not to have things like that in the way that stop us from being able to improve our self-care. So just moving on, I'm going to talk a little bit about this issue of not enough time. And I think in reality, for me, that's because I don't make it a priority. And, I don't know if anybody relates to this, and it's particularly difficult in Zoom land because I've no idea if anybody is nodding or not, but and maybe that's not a bad thing. But I certainly think I don't always make self-care a priority or well-being. And I think sometimes that's to do with the fact that we can sometimes mistakenly align self-care with self-indulgence or pampering. And I think that's wrong. But I think it's partly a cultural thing too. I think in Ireland we really value hard work, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think we also need to value well-being and self-care. You can have that kind of narrative, oh, there goes Sarah Clarke, she's on another holiday, she already had a holiday this year. That kind of attitude of, well, isn't it well for her, and I think we just have to watch out for that, but particularly if it stops us personally from allowing ourselves to take care of ourselves. And moving on to the next slide, related to this is this tool that is very helpful, which is learning to say no. Because one thing that we can do is say, I don't have enough time to do something for my well-being because I'm too busy doing X, Y, and Z. And when I get all that sorted out, then I will get back to myself. And just the next slide there, please, Mary. This is related to this whole idea of people pleasing and excessive self-sacrificing. And this, what I'm talking about, is a focus on meeting the needs of others in daily situations. But the key bit about this is that can be at the expense of your own needs. And I really need to acknowledge that for many, many people, it's not possible to not prioritize other people's needs. So you may be caring for children, or you may have other people dependent on you, and you may not be in a position to always put your own needs first, and I'm very, very aware of that. But it's more just to have this idea in our head that when possible, it really is okay and important to think about your own needs. And people pleasing always, it comes from a good place. It's usually about not wanting to cause pain to others or not to feel guilty because you want to be seen as selfish. And it can come from really a really strong ability to empathize and be very aware of other people's pain. It can sometimes so lead to a feeling that your own needs aren't being met, and that can end up leading to a bit of resentment. And then just the last point, Mary, please, is I suppose the most important bit is that it can involve pushing yourself beyond your own resources. And I'm an adult and I'm therefore responsible for my own well-being and for doing my best to mind myself. But if I continually neglect my own well-being and my own needs, that's not going to be helpful. So just moving on then, I suppose I like this quote: when you say yes to others, make sure you're not saying no to yourself. And in the next slide, I just talk a little bit about some ways to say no, and maybe everyone listening is thinking, I'm great at saying no, but for those of you who aren't, it's really good to have a couple of phrases on standby when you're on the spot and to practice these and be ready. And I think particularly this last one, I think we almost have to justify if we say no to something, so like if someone said, Sarah, do you want to go for a coffee on Friday? And I might be like, oh God, I have that other thing I want to do, and I have that bit of work to do, and then I said I do this and do that, and really it should be okay for me to say no, thanks very much, that's lovely, but maybe another time, because in my head I just want to sit and watch telly and not do anything on Friday. So next slide, please, Mary. Yeah, you can just go back 2 bits, although it's probably a bit late now, but if you can just leave the title, although it doesn't really matter, it's fine. I'm just going to, I suppose, tell a little story, and then the pictures will make a bit more sense. So about a year ago, or maybe, no, it's a bit more than a year ago, because it's before COVID, I had a deadline, and I was in work, and I was thinking I'll get that bit done today for tomorrow. But that day in work ended up going a bit pear-shaped, and unexpected things kept happening, and I kept being pulled in different directions. And I got to 5:30 and I was wrecked, and I hadn't got the work done for the deadline. So I thought, I'll get home now, I'll have a quick bite to eat, and then I'll focus and get this important bit of work done. And I ran out the door. The traffic was really bad, so this is before COVID. Ran out, got home to my apartment block, and I need my phone to ring a number to get in through the electronic gate. And I went to reach my phone and realized I left my phone in work. And I thought, it doesn't matter, someone else will let me in. And then I realized, but I need my phone because it's the only alarm I have, and otherwise I won't wake up tomorrow. And so it's like, I'm going to have to go back into work. So turned the car, didn't even turn around. I just did a loop and kept going back to work, and got into the office, which was locked because of course I hadn't gone home. And the key that was usually left out wasn't there. So I was locked out of the office. And then I had to try and phone security, and I couldn't get them. And so you can just imagine that my stress was going up and up and up. And I was feeling more and more distressed. Eventually got my phone, loads of missed calls, and a message to say my sister's mother-in-law had just died. And this is awful, but my first thought was, I don't have time to go to a funeral, which is I'm not proud of. And then got back into the car. The traffic was still bad. And at this point, I was really, really tired. And you can put up the pictures now, Mary, because I decided the best thing I can do now is go to the garage and buy a bottle of wine, which is exactly what I did. And I also got some chocolate. I gave up on the deadline because I was just too tired, too stressed. I had a glass of wine, I had some chocolate. I think I was going to a Love Island phase then, watched some Love Island, and then I went to bed. And I suppose what I want to demonstrate by this is that sometimes we're in a crisis, we will pick very reactive strategies to soothe ourselves, or self-care strategies. And there is nothing wrong with that on occasion. There's nothing wrong with having a glass of wine if you had a bad day, or some chocolate, or watch a bit of crap telly. But the problem is if that's your only way of managing your well-being. If my only way of looking after myself is to have a glass of wine, eat loads of chocolate, and avoid the world by going to bed, it's probably not going to end well. And the whole point about this is that well-being is an active process. It's something we build and we work on. It's not something we just go to when we're in a crisis. And it's about getting some balance. So, and again, I'm not saying these things are bad, but I'm just saying on their own, they're probably not the best strategies for well-being. And the last bit is all or nothing thinking. And all or nothing thinking just refers to this cognitive thing that we can do sometimes in lots of different situations in life. But certainly what I tend to do sometimes is think, okay, I go through phases in life where I might be relatively fit, I'm going to the gym regularly, and that's going fine. And then I stop for whatever reason, and I think I'm really unfit now. And I think, well, I could go for a walk at lunch for 10 minutes. And then I think, well, there's no point though, because I'm really unfit. I'm going for a walk for 10 minutes. It won't make any difference to anything. So there's no point. So it's that all or nothing thing, and it could be a similar thing of, oh, will I have that really healthy salad for tea? Oh, there's no point because I've been eating rubbish all week, and there's no point. And again, all or nothing thinking. Or I've had 2 chocolate biscuits. Oh, I might as well have the whole packet. So all or nothing. And I think the reality is actually going for a walk at lunch for 10 minutes is a good thing to do, and is definitely better than not going for a walk for 10 minutes. Even if it's a small thing, it is still a good thing to do. And I try and change all or nothing to something is better than nothing. And I think, again, it comes back to the point of investing in your well-being, investing in yourself, and seeing it as an active process that we work on all the time, not something we just do in a crisis when our body is telling us, you're reaching your limit. And I think that day that I was telling that story and I ended up just having a bad day, it probably didn't come out of nowhere. I probably had been, hadn't planned ahead. Maybe my resources were low. I hadn't been sleeping enough, or all those things. And then when something unexpected happened, maybe I just didn't have enough resources to deal with it as well as I should have. And finally, just to say that there are many ways to promote well-being. And again, Miffy's going to give us some lovely examples now. But I think it's really important to find what works for you, because another barrier we can have is we get stuck on trying to do something that actually we don't like. So that's a picture of a seaweed bath that I tried a few years ago, and it was one of the most unrelaxing things I've ever done because I kept thinking of all the little sea creatures that could be lurking in the seaweed. So really important to find what works for you and stick to that. And again, as I said earlier, also very important to ask for help if you need it, or even if you think you need it and you're not sure, ask somebody. I think working on well-being is our first line of defense in keeping our mental health good. But sometimes it's really important to call in the defenses and the backup troops when we need it. So that's all from me, and thanks everybody for listening, if you are still listening out there, and I'll pass back over now, I think, to Mary. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Miffy. That was, apologies, Sarah.
No problem.
I'm thinking
Thanks,
ahead
Mary,
to Miffy already, but thank you so much, Sarah.
Okay.
That was brilliant.
And sorry,
very...
Mary, thanks for your excellent driving of my slides.
Oh, not at all, not at all. Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. And I think that's very relatable. And we will have a chance to come back if anyone needs to kind of explore any further some of the things Sarah said in our Q&A in a little while. But now I'd like to give a warm welcome to Miffy from Mental Health Ireland. And just to mention that Mental Health Ireland are an amazing organisation, and they have some superb resources. So I would recommend for everyone to, do, when you have time, go and have a look on the website and check what's happening online and in your local area as well. It's well worth having a look at. So Miffy, you're very welcome. I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mary, for your kind introduction. So good evening, everybody. And thank you, Sarah, for your presentation, which has obviously, it's a nice segue now into what I'm going to talk to you all about, which is about self-care. I'm just going to share my screen with you. So just bear with me a wee moment while I get my presentation up. So hopefully you can now see my slides. So we're going to talk about self-care and well-being, and just to sort of frame that for you, I want you to think about this statement that you can't pour from an empty cup. And I think that no matter what is going on in our lives, no matter, whether we're working or not working, whether we're well or unwell, whether we have commitments to other people or not, this statement is true for us all. Because a lot of us tend to give a lot in all kinds of ways and for all sorts of reasons. But maybe we are supporting other people along with living with a chronic illness like epilepsy. And so we're on in give mode, if you like, Sarah spoke there about, barriers to supporting our well-being, and one being, not having enough time. And sometimes that not having enough time is down to the idea that everybody else's needs come first. And so we prioritize other people and their needs and other commitments. And, as Sarah was describing the deadline, that came first. But of course, that's not sustainable. It's not sustainable to always be on output, to always be pouring from our cup, because eventually it will empty. And then what do we do? That is when we get to burnout. And that is when we tend to gravitate towards the well-being tools that maybe aren't so healthy. They feel good at the time. They give us a kind of a sense of, being able to switch off. And whether it's the glass of wine or the chocolate or the, watching trash TV or whatever it might be, but ultimately it doesn't necessarily make us feel better. It helps us to distract from what's going on in our lives. So just to think about that as I go through my presentation with you about what it is for you around that giving of yourself, around that using your inner resources for others or for other commitments, and not having enough left for yourself. So I'm going to introduce you to the 5 ways to well-being. Okay, so back in 2008, the New Economics Foundation sort of studied all of the research into these activities and into well-being, and the focus was to sort of establish the mental capital of the population. And so they did loads of surveys, surveyed people into what kind of activities they did. They surveyed them to find out what their baseline for well-being was. Then they sent them on various sort of activities related, to promoting well-being. And then they measured their well-being through questionnaires again afterwards. And what consistently came through from all of the research was that these 5 ways to well-being were, proving to improve people's sense of well-being. Okay, so connect, be active, take notice, keep learning, and give were what came out on top. So what I'm going to do now is take you through each of these step by step with all the various connotations for each sort of theme, if you like, if we want to call them themes, which then you can sort of, attach activities to your list under the heading of the theme. Okay, so we'll begin with connect. So connecting is really important. And the first thing that's really important is that we connect with ourselves. Connecting with our needs, let's say, connecting with how we feel. Sometimes even just connecting with our, where we are in our environment. Sometimes we're so wrapped up in our thinking that we mightn't actually necessarily feel like we are at home, if you like. So connecting with ourselves is the first point. And then connecting with others. Okay, so whether that's our friends, whether that's our family, whether it's our neighbors, it's people in our community, maybe it's peer support, people who are going through the same thing we're going through, but that connection. And if this last year has taught us nothing, it's taught us how important connecting with other people is when we can no longer do it in the way we used to. And how we have learned to adapt to communicate and connect in different ways. So here we are now on a webinar. Now, a year and a bit ago, you might go see the odd webinar. It was probably something international that was being hosted. Local webinars weren't really a thing so much. Whereas now, there's nearly 50 of you watching this tonight, and I'm presuming that we're from all over the place, so, learning to connect with others in other ways has been a really vital way of supporting our well-being over the last year and a bit. So, there's loads of evidence to show that when we have meaningful social connection, we do better. So it's that meaningful connection. Now, the meaning could be that you just stood and spoke across the wall to your neighbor about the weather, or about how well their azalea is looking now that it's in bloom, you know, but that connection had meaning to you both, you know, that it cheered you up, or it just made you feel connected to your neighbor in some way, or less alone, or whatever it might be. So the meaning is your own interpretation of the meaning, but that it is meaningful social connection. And it might be just to hear another human being's voice, or it might be to sit and talk about, you know, putting the world to rights, or it might be sort of saying, look, you know, I'm not feeling great. I'm feeling a bit down this weather. I'm not sleeping very well, you know, and making a connection that way. But connecting with others is really important. And then, of course, it's connecting with our environment. You know, I'm sitting here now and I've got the window a little open because it's quite warm in my office, and I can hear the birds outside, and they're starting to get into their evening sort of lilt there and singing away to me. You know, and I've noticed that the weather's got very still. There was a big breeze up earlier on, but now when I look out the window there, you know, it's got very still, and the sycamore is just coming into leaf, and it's very still out there right now, and the bird song is very clear. So, you know, things like that, connecting with where we are, the place that we find ourselves, is really important and really good for our well-being. Because it makes us feel more grounded, more centered, and just connected to a place, you know, like if we're out walking, for example, really connect with the place you're in, because it's very tempting while we're walking to have our heads away somewhere else. You know, we could be thinking about other things and not actually present, and we'll talk a bit more about that when we look at take notice. But, you know, connecting with where you are is really important. So just in terms then of what I posed to you at the start, you know, that you cannot pour from an empty cup, you might think about this for yourself now around connection. And in what ways might you find to connect, you know? Do you need to connect more with yourself? Are there ways that you can connect more meaningfully with other people? You know, and in what ways might you connect with your environment? And what is there in your environment that is meaningful, that is nurturing, that is supportive to you, that you can connect with, you know? So just to be kind of, you know, mulling that over for yourself and bringing that into the context of your own situation. So let's move to be active. So our Department of Health recommendations, HSE recommendations, are that as adults, we have 30 minutes a day of moderate exercise 5 days out of 7, okay? That's the bare minimum for a grown adult, all right? Within your abilities and so on. So that moderate exercise means that we use our bodies to the point where, you know, our heart rate is elevated. We can feel ourselves, you know, that we're active, but we're not puffed out. We could hold a conversation with somebody, or we could recite a poem to ourselves without being breathless. So that's sort of the guidelines. But obviously it has to be within your abilities, and you start where you are and you build on that. And that 30 minutes a day doesn't have to be done in one block either. It could be done in 3 10 minutes, or it could be done in 2 15 minutes, or whatever way you want to break it down. But that's what we're encouraged to do. So physical activity is also proven to be very beneficial for boosting our mood and well-being. And in fact, in some studies, it is shown that regular moderate exercise that I've described is as useful for treating mild to moderate depression as antidepressants are, because it generates endorphins, okay, which are feel-good hormones essentially. All right, so serotonin and oxytocin and dopamine would be classic feel-good hormones, okay, that we would talk about. They're neurotransmitters in the brain. And exercise generates those, which also helps to reduce physical pain, as well as boosting our sense of well-being and our mood. So there's our physical activity and exercise. It boosts these endorphins. And the minimum of 30 minutes of moderate exercise, 5 days out of 7. Okay, but it's not just physical activity that we need to be mindful of. Mental activity as well helps to keep us alert. It helps to improve our brain health, our memory, our mental flexibility. Okay, so you know, lots of people like to do crosswords or Sudokus or word searches and that to keep their brains active. But equally, things like crochet and knitting and star weaving, there's all sorts of ways of boosting our mental activity. Jigsaws, reading, you know, all of these things help to promote mental activity, which in turn boosts our mental health. So again, being mindful of activity, what is that for you? And you see, the other thing about physical activity, it doesn't have to be the classic walking, running, swimming. It could be yoga, it could be Pilates, it could be more Tai Chi, you know, things that are much gentler and that, but they're very meditative as well. So you're using your body, but you're also engaging in a meditative activity. It could be gardening. You know, even hoovering is a physical activity that can be fun if you put your mind to it. But anyway, you know, it's just to be mindful of in the context of your own situation, what ways can you, you know, engage more in physical activity that's going to help boost those feel-good factors, and what mental activities can you engage in, you know, that are going to also help you in this regard. So just to be mindful of that, how these things will refill your cup. So let's have a look then at take notice. So take notice is in here as one of the 5 ways to well-being, as being, you know, another evidence-based wellness tool. So when we take notice, what we're doing essentially is being present to the moment, okay? Being present to what is. Because very often in our lives, we're not present. We're elsewhere. We're distracted. You know, when Sarah was describing that stressful evening she had when she arrived back and didn't have her phone with her, I'm sure even though the traffic was heavy on the way back to the office, she probably wasn't really connected with the traffic and present to the traffic. Her mind was on, oh my God, I got to get to this phone, and how am I going to get sorted? You know, we tend to spend a lot of time either in the past or in the future. We ruminate over old things. We ruminate over things that people said, and they go on a loop in our head. And then we sort of invent all this stuff about, you know, what we're going to say to them the next time we see them. We're going to give them a piece of our mind, and we construct and compose and even rehearse, you know, a big conversation with them, which probably won't ever happen, but we use a lot of energy and attention on that scenario. Equally, you know, we jump into the future and we worry about things that may come, and we're really good. We've got amazing imaginations. We can create incredible scenarios in the future for ourselves from our imagination that may or may not ever happen. So, you know, being present to what is requires some skills, and this is where mindfulness practice comes in. So when we practice mindfulness, we become more self-aware. We become aware of our feelings, our thoughts, our reactions, our responses. You know, all of those things are our responses to what's happening in the world and in our life here and now, in the here and now. And the thing about mindfulness practice is that it allows us to learn how to be aware of these things, how to connect with these things, to be mindful of these things without necessarily having to react. without having to fix anything, without having to do anything about it. We're able to sort of step back and observe almost, be witness to our own responses, be witness to our own thoughts without having to follow them or engage with them. So mindfulness practices help us to learn to do that. And it may be a simple thing as following a breath all the way in and all the way out again. And taking notice of that process. And there's a beautiful thing that happens when we follow our breath. So just by taking one deep and full breath and following it all the way in and all the way out, that actually helps to intercept the stress response. And it helps to slow down the heart rate, slow down the breathing, slow down the thinking, gives us that little bit of a space. It's one breath, it's one pause, so that we can just choose what our next step is going to be. Okay, it helps us with that. Just creating space between what's happening and how we're going to react. Another lovely way of practicing taking notice is just noticing your environment. We spoke about that in Connect, in the sense that we connect with our environment, noticing the weather, noticing nature, noticing birdsong, you know, noticing the seasons change. I don't know about where you live, but the cherry blossoms in Smithborough are glorious right now. They've all just burst forth and they're a pleasure. And when I sit and eat my breakfast, I look down the street and I see them all and they're just beautiful. So, you know, it's things like that. And when I'm sitting enjoying the cherry blossom, I'm not worrying about my pearly granddaughter in Scotland, or I'm not fretting about something related to work that's got a deadline on it. And, you know, I'm in that moment enjoying the cherry blossoms. It doesn't take away the things I have to worry about. It doesn't stop those things existing. But what it does is it helps me to just not entertain those things for now. Just for now. For this moment, I can take notice of what is present to me in this moment. So, you know, and sometimes the present moment isn't pleasant. There's a really nice meme, I'm sorry I don't have it here on my slides actually, of the Cookie Monster. And he says, just for this moment, me will be present. Unless the moment is unpleasant, and then me will eat a cookie. So you know, the Cookie Monster is quite right there. Sometimes when the moment is unpleasant, we might reach for the cookies or the glass of wine or the chocolate or whatever else it might be. But, you know, the present moment isn't always enjoyable. But mindfulness helps us to just take notice of the fact, well, this isn't a pleasant moment, but that's okay. This too shall pass, or I can get past this, or what do I want to do? How do I want to respond to this? And maybe you will actively choose, well, do you know what? I'm going to have a few chocolates. And that's okay, but you made a discerning choice rather than it just being a go-to. Or you might decide, do you know what? I think I'll go for a walk. That would be better for me. Or I think I'll phone my friend and have a chat, you know, when the moment is unpleasant. So just again, just bring to mind what it is for you in the context of your situation that taking notice is meaningful for you. Then we move on to keep learning. So, you know, we think of learning and there are formal ways of learning and informal ways of learning. So formal learning is, I suppose, school and, you know, third level education and going and, you know, taking a course in something. And then informal learning is where you just choose to learn something new. Like you might set yourself, you know, a task to learn a new skill, you know, or take up a hobby, follow an interest that you have. You know, maybe you've always been interested in your family tree and you take a notion that, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to research my family tree. And so, you know, that can be a lovely way of learning. Or you might learn a new language, and you mightn't learn the whole language. You just might decide, you know what I'm going to do this week now? I'm going to learn all the days of the week in Spanish. And next week, I'm going to learn to count to 20 in German, or whatever it might be, you know. But there's a really interesting thing that occurs when we are open to learning, okay? So no matter what it is, we put ourselves, set ourselves up to learn, okay? And there is a lovely old saying that every day is a school day, and that we should be open to learning. And there's a very solid and sound reason why. When we make learning new things and being open to new things a part of our daily life, it might be learning a new recipe, or, like I said, learning a new skill like wood turning or crochet or whatever it might be. It actually sets us up to be much more likely to seek out solutions when we are faced with adversity. When we're faced with a problem or a challenge or a difficulty or some adversity, if we are in the habit of learning new things, we are much more likely to ask for help, to seek out answers to our problem or solutions to our problem. So I just think that that is really fascinating. The other thing about keep learning, and all of the 5 ways boost our neurotransmitters, these feel-good hormones that I talked about. And when we learn something new or accomplish something, when we're learning a new skill, we get a little shot of dopamine, because that is the hormone for reward. And it makes us feel accomplished. So that's a good thing, okay? So learning sets us up to be solution focused and promotes help seeking behavior. So if we find ourselves in difficulty, we're much more likely to ask for help if we're already open to learning new things, which to me is just brilliant. The last of the 5 ways, and I'm looking at the time, we're not doing so bad here. The last of the 5 ways is give. And give can be, you know, again, thinking of this in the context of your own life and your own situation. It could be the formal sort of volunteering type giving. So people get Garda vetted and they, you know, become either befrienders, let's say, in the community, or they work in the local charity shop, or, you know, whatever else it might be in terms of volunteering. Meals on Wheels are often run by volunteers and things like that. And that is really good. People who volunteer their time without expectation of reward, who are involved in their communities in a volunteering capacity, have much better health outcomes. They live longer and they tend to be much happier people. So that's a good thing to remember. But it's not just formal giving that we're talking about. We're talking about giving people some space, let's say, giving a listening ear, you know, supporting other people in some way. That is giving of ourselves without expectation of reward. And it might be that you have a skill that is of benefit to somebody else. So you can support somebody, let's say, in doing up their accounts, because you have that skill and they're struggling with it. And so you help them. It might be a family member, it might be a friend, it might be a neighbor, you know. And there's absolutely no expectation of reward. Now, they might buy you a box of chocolates, or, you know, they might thank you, or they might take you on a nice, you know, out for a nice meal when everything's open up again. But that's not why you're doing it. You're doing it because you care. And this is, you know, really good for our well-being, because it makes us feel good. It makes us feel good, even though we're doing it for somebody else. It makes them feel good, but it also makes us feel good. So, you know, there's that prayer, St. Francis, sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied, that says, in giving we receive. So there's that to think about. And the other thing is that we mustn't leave ourselves out, you know, of all this picture. We need to give to ourselves as well. We need to give ourselves time and space. We need to give ourselves space for self-care, time for self-care. And also, you know, remember that we're human. We're human, we're fallible, things go wrong. You know, no matter what, you know, our plans might have been, they can change, you know, because of living with a chronic conditions such as epilepsy. As you know, it's so unpredictable, and all of those things. So it's about cutting yourself some slack, giving yourself a break, you know. And last but not least, random acts of kindness are a way of giving. So an example, let's say, of a random act of kindness might be that you, let's say you're in a car park and you have a ticket on your car, a parking ticket, and it doesn't matter whether you're the driver or you're the passenger, but there's a parking ticket, and you're back at the car, and there's another half an hour left on this ticket that's valid, but you're leaving, so it's of no use to you. So you see somebody else parking, and you decide, do you know what, I'm going to give this ticket to that person, right? So you give that ticket to that person. So that's a random act of kindness. And the other person is, oh, thank you so much. That's really thoughtful of you, and that's great. So let me tell you what's happening here. In terms of our well-being, and in terms of those lovely feel-good hormones I talked about and the neurotransmitters that this creates. So when we connect with other people, there is a hormone called oxytocin, a neurotransmitter called oxytocin that is created when we connect with other people in a meaningful way. It's called the love hormone because it's to do with bonding and it's to do with connection with others. So going back to our random act of kindness. So let's say it's me that has the ticket with the half hour on it, and I give it to the person. In that gesture, I receive a little dart of dopamine and oxytocin, okay, which lift me up. They're feel-good hormones. The person receiving the ticket, they too get a boost of dopamine and oxytocin from this interaction that we shared. Just, here's a ticket that's got half an hour on it. Oh, great, thank you very much. Simple as that. Now, here's the rub. There's a person sitting in another car, doesn't know either of us from Adam, all right, watching this interaction unfold, watching this random act of kindness occur. And hey, guess what happens just from sitting watching it? They too get a little boost of dopamine and oxytocin that makes them feel good. So the potential for random acts of kindness is actually phenomenal in terms of our well-being and bringing well-being to the world. So, you know, just to be mindful of that. And it doesn't have to be giving somebody the ticket. It might be bringing somebody you love a cup of tea and saying, thank you for being in my life or for all the things you do for me. Or it might be just writing a note to somebody that you haven't seen in a while and you want to know how they are and you want them to know that you're thinking of them. Whatever it might be. It might be helping somebody with their shopping. It might be just standing back while somebody else gets on with something with our physical distancing we're all practicing and so on. So again, just being mindful of what this means for you in the context of your situation. You know, what does giving mean to you and how can you apply it? So just recapping on our 5 ways: connect, be active, take notice, keep learning, and give. And these, you can think of them as your 5 a day. You know, we're encouraged to eat, well, I think they've changed it now. They've moved the goalposts. We're supposed to have 7 portions of fruit and veg a day. But these 5 ways to well-being are really useful ways to frame activities and wellness tools that we can use to boost our well-being and to help us on a daily basis. They don't solve all the problems of the world, but very often they're just activities that don't necessarily cost anything. They don't have to cost a thing, okay? But they're very accessible, you know? So just being mindful of that. So I'm just going to pose this question to you now. How will you fill your cup? So thinking about these 5 ways to well-being, anything that resonated with you throughout what I was sharing with you and what Sarah shared, and you know, what is it that you can do for yourself? What is it that you can engage with in terms of activities, in terms of even a mindset around those 5 ways to well-being? And how are you going to refill your cup to keep your well-being topped up, and keep yourself restored, and your own inner resources topped up on a regular basis, so that you can engage in these things daily? And you might want to make a note of them. You know, you might want to jot them down on a post-it and stick them up on your fridge, and maybe review them every week or every 2 weeks. Or you might want to introduce the idea to your family and have 5 ways to well-being ideas, you know, amongst the family. Ways, how are we going to connect this week as a family? How are we going to be active this week as a family? You know, how are we going to give or keep learning, or all of, you know, all of the 5 ways, how you can incorporate them into your world, into your life, and into your own personal situation and what it means to you personally. So folks, I'm not going to keep you any longer. I want to thank you for your time and your attention. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to hand you back to Mary. And thanks ever so much, folks.
Thank you very much, Miffy. That was excellent. Yeah, I think there's a lot there to take. And if I remember correctly, on the Mental Health Ireland website, I know there's a lot of resources and information about the 5 ways to connect, so people can follow up that as well. So yeah, so just going to, conscious of time, going to move on to a couple of questions. We've had a few in that are kind of similar, so I'm going to maybe touch on a few of them. If Sarah and Miffy want to come back on, and we can get straight into those, if that's okay. So the first thing that's coming up is number of people mentioning memory problems, and particularly around the anxiety and the frustration associated with maybe short-term memory issues or whatever the case might be. Would you have any advice or kind of comment around that?
So I'll jump in there. Unfortunately, yeah, memory difficulties can be quite commonly experienced in epilepsy, and that can be due to a multitude of factors. So it can be directly related to seizures and you know, interruption of brain circuits during seizures, and also medication effects. Sometimes what people experience as memory difficulties is actually a secondary problem due to an attention difficulty. So if we're not able to pay attention fully to something, information doesn't go into our brain, and therefore it's not there to remember. And again, that can be due to, you know, directly due to seizure-related factors, medication factors. And it's difficult to talk about individual cases because so many things contribute to these problems. And in terms of solutions, I suppose there's some generics. So, you know, things that help with memory and attention difficulties include a lot of what Miffy spoke about. But also things like good sleep, you know, good diet, being well hydrated, keeping stress to a minimum. These are all things we can do to help our cognitive function. But the other thing that is helpful, if it is an option for people, is to have an assessment done of their memory and to find out maybe where the particular difficulties lie. But there are a mixture of both generic strategies as well as more specifics that can be tailored to an individual. But all the things that Miffy has spoken about there will have a knock-on effect on helping with memory. Any way we can reduce pressure on our brain frees up more resources to be able to focus our attention and to help with memory.
Thanks, Sarah.
Can I just add to that around the stress? Because I think stress, we shouldn't underestimate the impact of stress and trauma on our memory. And I'll share with you a recent example from my own life, if that's okay. And I suppose appropriately enough, it related to epilepsy in a way. I have a granddaughter with a severe form of epilepsy who became very, very unwell recently. And I had to drop everything and go and support her mum and family because she was in hospital and very, very early. Now, I'm back at work now, and the trauma of all that, thankfully, she's made a recovery, and she's doing really well again. But several times in the last week or two that I've been back at work, I've actually realized that before, the couple of weeks before I had to drop everything, there are things that happened that I don't actually remember. And things I did and wrote and all sorts of things that I have no memory of doing. And that happened this afternoon. I came across this thing that obviously I did put together, and I have no memory of it because it happened just before just before this traumatic event that was so stressful. And so, you know, it is a normal response to stress. So to be mindful of that. So keeping our stress levels low and manageable, and especially when we're going through trauma, you know, and epilepsy is traumatic, you know, and to be mindful of that and to cut ourselves a little bit of slack. So yeah.
Absolutely, thank you. And just briefly then, there was a kind of a comment more than a question, and I think it reflects back on both of your talks actually in a way, and a gentleman just mentions about the importance of having maybe like a range of activities or, you know, things to get involved in and finding what works for you. And he just mentions about looking at what's in your own locality, looking for local activities that might incorporate some of the 5 ways, or as you said, Sarah, finding what works for you. So I thought that was good. Just another question that actually has a couple of parts to it, but I think it's a good question. Person mentions their family member has unfortunately started suffering from mental health issues since her seizures began. He says that specifically it was recognized that the activity was in the frontal lobe, and he asks if this is related. And the other part of his question then is, he mentions that the family member themselves is very, very reluctant to discuss their mental health with the professionals, with the doctor, with the neurologist, and in fact will say that everything's fine when it clearly isn't. And he just asks, would there be any advice that you might have around that situation? Sarah, do you want to start on that one? I know it specifically mentions, I suppose, around the frontal lobe, when you might kind of...
Sure. So again, I suppose it's difficult without knowing the full story here. So I don't want to give any misleading information, but certainly the frontal lobes, you know, are responsible for overseeing a lot of different activities in terms of our behaviour, and in terms of also our insight into our behaviour, so our understanding of what's going on for ourselves, and it can be very much involved in helping to kind of regulate our states, and so it could be related to this person's mental health difficulties, but it's also possible that the mental health difficulties are just happening in parallel to the epilepsy, you know, so I need a little bit more, you know, background to be able to say for certain, but it's not impossible that they're connected. It's a very tricky thing when you can see somebody you love suffering and they're either for whatever reason don't want to discuss that with their healthcare provider, and we have to be, you know, mindful of people's privacy and confidentiality. I suppose my advice would be, if possible, for this person to sit down with their daughter and gently maybe start asking a little bit about, get a sense of what her understanding is. I'm not quite clear if it's that the daughter is aware she has some difficulties and just doesn't want to talk about them, or just isn't aware of them, which are 2 slightly different things. If it's that she's not aware of them, it might be helpful to gently start to give a little bit of feedback around what they're noticing. Or if it's a case that she is aware of the difficulties and just doesn't want to go there, it might be helpful maybe to gently ask what her fears are around that. You know, what's her fear of talking about it? and that they express their concern. You know, they've noticed this. I think the difficulty is she's an adult, so they can't just go independently to her doctor and discuss it without letting her know that they're doing that, because the risk then is you break that trust relationship that you have. It is a difficult one, but I think definitely I'd be starting with it, you know, trying to get a little bit more understanding of what her barriers are to talking about her doctor, because there are loads and loads of options to help, but the starting point has to be understanding a little bit more about what's going on there. Because the other thing to think about is I don't know what medication this girl is on, and I'm not a medical doctor, but as I mentioned, some of the medications as well can influence our emotional state, and it might be worth thinking about that too.
And I suppose on a similar note then, and Miffy, I might put it to you, had a question about, I suppose, how we might support someone who is isolated, or maybe isolating because of the COVID-19 situation, and kind of any advice around how to support them, maybe kind of from a distance as well.
I think it's really important, I suppose, in a situation like that, to just check in with people. And no more than the last question, I suppose, we can't make people talk about how they're feeling, but we can create a space that's safe for them to talk about how they're feeling, and to share if they're not feeling great. So, you know, there are ways of doing that, and partly it is just that touching in, you know, a text even, or a call, or, you know, just I'm here. And do that on a regular basis. And some people are absolutely open to it, and other people maybe it's a little harder to get them to engage. And you see, I think more generally, when people have a condition and it has a serious clinical side to it, you know, I think sometimes there's so much emphasis on the clinical end of it, and of managing the clinical symptoms and the medication and all of those things that go with it, that it's almost as if the mental health aspects are secondary. They're not as important, because there's this clinical thing to sort of manage, which in acute illness is fair enough. But there is always a time when we need to be balancing that and keeping in mind that the mental well-being of somebody is actually paramount, because, you know, that is what is actually going to help the person to get well, you know. So yeah, keep reaching out, keep encouraging, you know, and if you can at all, get them to engage with peer support as well, because it can be difficult for loved ones, because they love and they care and they really want the best for their friends and their family who are unwell. But sometimes they're pushed away because they don't necessarily get it. They're up close to it, but they're not the person with the epilepsy or whatever the condition might be. And so peer support for that person, with people with lived experience of what they are also going through, is really, really important. And that can be, so helping them to get that can be, and not to take it personally that you're not the person who can offer all the support, that, you know, so that's important.
That's great, thank you, Miffy. I'm just conscious of our time, so just going to squeeze in one or two more. The question came up, and I wonder if you'd have any direction around mental health around the menopause as well. So I know it's quite a specific area, but would you have any, I suppose, signposting even, or I suppose around that particular area?
Yeah, I've done some work, and actually again this year with Dopers for Women here in County Monaghan, called Mind Your Menopause, and it is a presentation and that around menopause, and I have a link to a sort of a recorded version of that, which I can send on to you, Mary, that you can circulate it with your members if you wish.
That would be great. Thank you, Miffy.
Yeah, but there is all sorts of stuff happening with our hormones during menopause, and we can develop anxiety and all sorts of things because of the sort of hormonal imbalances and so on. And we also, there's a lot of psychological stuff around a sense of you know, losing our womanhood or those sorts of things, or just feeling so different that we're wondering, am I losing my mind? You know, and forgetfulness and all of those things that are really horrid, and hot flushes, and maybe not feeling so sexy or attractive as we used to, and you know, just all the horrible stuff that goes with it. and that is going to impact on our mental health and our sense of self and our sense of identity, and it's you know, it's such a process. But getting help, talking to somebody, talking to your other female friends, you know, and what they've been through, and getting a sense, and there's loads of books out there too about menopause. But yeah, it's important to talk about it and to get some support and counselling if need be, definitely. Sarah, you might have more to add to that, but.
No, I'm just nodding in agreement. And I think, you know, it comes back, I touched on that idea of loss. I think menopause is a time of loss in some ways as well, and important to acknowledge that, because there's huge changes happening. I think we're gradually getting to acknowledge the extent of the change that menopause can bring, and again, cognitively, we're getting to understand the impact much more. There's very real changes in attention systems and how we're able to process information during menopause. It's probably up to now quite a relatively neglected area, but it's beginning to get the attention it deserves. And I think, again, it comes back to being, you know, kind to yourself. It's a challenging time for lots of reasons, and the impact it has is very real, both psychologically and cognitively, and physically, and all those things are connected. So it's actually great to have this brought up as a discussion point. I think it's really relevant, and it'd be great. I'd be really interested too, Miffy, in that link that you're talking about, just to have more resources for people. I think it's really important.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Thank you, Miffy. Yeah, I think we might leave it at that in terms of the questions. There were a couple of more questions, but we might respond to them individually afterwards. So just for before I close, when this meeting is over, you'll be sent a survey, and at the end of it, there's the option to leave your email address for follow-up. And if you do that, we'll be able to send you on the resources and the information as well. Or if you had a specific question, which we'll take note of through the Q&A, we'd be able to follow up with you and direct you on that as well. And just want to share with you one last slide as well, if that's okay, just to show. So just I can email this out as well. So I suppose it was just to kind of summarize some of the, I suppose, information and support options. And it's only some, because there is so much going on in every county, in every community, that we couldn't list them all. But I suppose for clinical or acute issues, I suppose your first port of call could be your GP or your neurology team or your HSE mental health team as well. And again, that's not exhaustive. There are other options too. And then for community and online types of support, there's a list there of some of the common organisations or popular organisations. And then the HSE itself has a list of mental health services across all counties as well. So again, we can send that information out. So just to close, just want to say thank you so much for Miffy and Sarah for joining us tonight and for your time. I think it's been really, really useful, and I know it's a topic we could talk at length on, and we will revisit it again. But just for tonight, just want to say again, thank you so much for your time, and for all of you who have logged in as well to join us this evening. And we will be in touch with you if you request follow-up afterwards. So thank you very much, and going to bring to a close. Thank you.
Thanks.
Good evening.
Thanks, everybody.